I'm Lola Blanc.
And I'm Megan Elizabeth.
And we're the hosts of Trust Me, the podcast about cults, extreme belief, and the abuse of power.
Now on podcast 1.
We're real-life cult survivors.
And we're here to tell you anyone can join a cult.
If you've ever dived headfirst into a new self-help program,
or believed wholeheartedly in a spiritual practice,
or even just trusted someone with your life,
guess what? You're just as susceptible as everyone else.
No one is safe, especially not Megan.
I'm the most susceptible.
We want to debunk the myth that people who join cults are uneducated or naive or broken, because anyone can be manipulated by a narcissist or feel good in a new group they've joined.
And we should know we both have been.
Join us every week as we explore the world of extreme belief,
talk to survivors and experts,
and share our own experiences with cults and the abuse of power.
Don't be fooled. You might be next.
Get new episodes of Trust Me every Wednesday on Podcast One, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you get your podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, Casey Anthony is guilty. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my multitasking co-host, Alice.
Hi, Brett. It is awesome to be here with you. Thanks for pointing out the fact, I do have a baby strapped to my chest right now. It's one of the, this is still the newborn stage where there's no schedule whatsoever. It could be 12 o'clock right now, p.m. It could be 12 o'clock a.m. Who knows? But... Oh, no, there she is.
Oh,
but
there's the baby.
If we don't record while she's strapped to my chest, we may never record. So we might as well do it.
It's true. So, be ashamed of yourself. Anybody complaining about Alice's sound, I want you to, shake your finger at yourself in the mirror right now. Alice is amazing. We're so glad to have her back. We've missed her so much. It's just so good to record with you, Alice. And I'm not just saying that. Brittany. It's great to have her, too. So...
Well, you guys, this is really hilarious because, yes, my sound quality is going to be awesome today because there might be some baby sounds in it. And you should give props to Jason, who edits our audio, because he probably has his work cut out for him today. So thanks, Jason, and sorry, Jason.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, and so today we are back with one of our episodes about how someone is clearly guilty despite the doubts of people, usually because of questionable documentaries. In this case, Casey Anthony. As most of you know, a couple months ago, maybe half a year at this point, a documentary came out. I forget the name of it. It was like Casey Anthony in her own words or something. And it was the first time Casey Anthony was going to speak truth to the camera and tell us exactly what happened to Kaylee. And in doing so, clear her own name. And I will tell you, I did not watch it for a while because I didn't want to hear Casey Anthony spout her lies. In case you didn't notice, this, like our Scott Peterson episode, will not be our most unbiased episode ever. And yes, I had some questions about even watching it, but so many people watched it and found it convincing and wanted us to sort of give our view on it. I was like, well, man, I guess we're going to have to watch it, Alice. And I got through it. Did you make it through all 3 episodes?
I made it through all 3 episodes, but not without a lot of yelling. So I also did not watch it for many months. And then people, kept writing us, and they wrote on the gallery Facebook page wall saying, this seems really convincing. And I didn't think it was going to be convincing, but I wanted to see what made people kind of doubt her guilt. And so the first, I think 5 minutes in, I texted you, Brett. I texted you and I was like, I can't do this. I can't watch this. I just can't make myself do this. There's so much to do in the world, in life. Why am I spending my time watching this? And that's how I felt through, honestly, all 3 episodes. So yeah, I think we're getting off to a really unbiased start.
Yes, I will just go ahead and tell you, I did not find it convincing. But we're going to talk about it, and we're going to explain to you why we didn't find it convincing. And I promise you, it's not just that we have a personal aversion to Casey, or we're so biased against her that we can't be swayed by her words. Like so many things, you have to take this and you have to compare it to the evidence. We talked about this in the Murdaugh trial when Alec Murdaugh testified. So many people focus so much on his demeanor, on his body language, on what he said, what he didn't say, how he said it, when he cried, if he cried. And all that's important. Not saying that you should ignore all of that, but the best thing to do when you have the actual statements of the people that you're trying to decide whether or not they are guilty of such a serious crime is to take their words and take the story that they tell you and compare it to the facts that we have. And that's the best way to get to truth. And in a lot of ways, this is amazing that we have Casey Anthony's own statements, because now we can take what she said. It's no longer just, hypothesizing about what happened. So many people have said, well, maybe it was an accident and she was just covering up an accident. Well, that's not what she says. And so let's go through the documentary and what we learn, and then see if the evidence that we know, the facts that we know for sure, line up with what Casey is telling us. If you haven't seen it, it begins with a shot of Casey, and she is lining up all the things in her room that matter so much to us. And she begins by telling us how the most precious things in her life remind her of Kaylee. And I got to tell you, I almost stopped right there. I almost stopped. 5 minutes into it, I was like, I don't know if I can do this. Another point, I guess they're filming on Mother's Day, and so we have to have this whole thing about how hard Mother's Day is for Casey. But Casey is going to tell us a story that's supposed to both evoke sympathy from the watcher and also to explain some of the things she did, and it really focuses on her father. Casey's story will be that she was abused by her father for much of her life and was concerned that he would abuse Kaylee too. And that's what sort of led to the circumstances that eventually led to Kaylee's death. And in fact, Casey was conditioned to lie. She was conditioned to lie by her father, and that's what she did. And we talked about some of this in our initial coverage of the Casey Anthony case. I think one thing that's really important for people to remember, this story is not new. This is the first time Casey has told it to us directly, but we've heard this before. And we covered this before. This is just Casey sort of doubling down and putting into the public, in her own words, the statements that we know that she had told her lawyers before. So this is essentially the same story that she initially told to Jose Baez. And what's going to be interesting is, as you listen to Casey, think back to our coverage of this when we talked about how Jose Baez's theory of the case and his defense developed, because what you see from Casey is really kind of the story that she told him before he took it and sort of polished it up.
The documentary obviously has an aim. There's obviously an audience for this. I mean, how many of us have watched this? We are doing an entire episode responding to the documentary, and people want to know what Casey Anthony had to say, because even if people think she is guilty and they think that she should have been convicted at trial, people still are struggling with trying to understand how a mother can do this to their child. We face this question a lot with the Murdaugh trials. Even if you think the evidence is all there to convict him, people struggled with the fact that a parent could do something so devastating to their child. And that's why this documentary is being made. But, of course, it begins with the schmaltzy, and it is schmaltzy. Whether she did it or not, it's schmaltzy, because she's putting out all this memorabilia when Kaylee was alive. So let's dive into the day that people want to know about, the day that Kaylee disappeared. According to Casey in this documentary, she always believed that Kaylee was okay. Casey doesn't remember much from that morning. Again, the day that your child disappears, the last time you see your child, and ultimately before she dies. Of course, 2020 is hindsight, but most people talk about how they can remember every detail, every scent, every, fiber of their being when they look back on that day, because it's a day that they relive in their mind over and over and over, because it is the most devastating day of their life. But Casey starts by saying she really doesn't remember much from that morning. And she describes the night before as a normal night. She said she woke up, she got breakfast for Kaylee, and then Casey said she didn't really feel well, so she laid back down. And Kaylee was sleeping with her. And Casey said she was a light sleeper, and she says she attributes this to the fact that her dad was raping her. Again, kind of throwing in this backstory that we've heard before at her defense. And she thought she'd locked the door, but she really doesn't remember. She does say that her dad was home. Casey says that after she laid down, she fell asleep and she slept for a long time. And ultimately, she was awoken by her father, who was shaking her and asking where Kaylee was. Casey responds that Kaylee would never leave on her own without waking her. She wasn't allowed to just be in the house by herself. She was a child. And Casey looked for her, but she couldn't find Kaylee anywhere. And she says that she looked everywhere. Kaylee had never done this before, and it was a surprise to her. And when Casey came around towards the pool, her dad was standing there with Kaylee in his arms. Casey says that Kaylee is soaking wet, and her dad handed Kaylee to her and told her it was her fault, that she did that she caused that. And she is just welling up with emotion at this point, tears in her eyes, and she said she collapsed with Kaylee in her arms, and that Kaylee was heavy and cold. And she goes on to describe that as she was sitting there with Kaylee in her lap, hysterical, staring at her, her dad takes Kaylee from Casey, tells Casey that it will be okay, and that Kaylee will be okay. Casey said that she wanted to believe her dad, and she wanted Kaylee to be okay. And then she says she didn't know where her dad went. He took Kaylee and walked away. Casey doesn't know what happened after that. She felt numb and broken and confused, but also hopeful because she believed that Kaylee was still okay. And when you watch her tell this version, they really get into it, right? They try to get to the heart of what everyone wants to know, what happened the day that Kaylee disappeared. And even her affect in telling the story is very interesting. I mean, the whole documentary is really shot with her sitting, as many documentaries are, facing directly the camera. I mean, it's just like a straight shot of her face. It's not the side. She's looking directly at the camera, and it feels rehearsed. She's clearly spoken these words before, whether by herself or to other people. It feels like she knows exactly what sentence is coming next. And even the way she tells it really is almost written like a novel, like the collapsing on the ground and the cold, heavy Kaylee in her arms. And again, it's hard to judge how someone's feeling and how they deliver the story, but this is truly any parent's worst nightmare. We're not talking about a situation where she doesn't know what happened to Kaylee. She is telling us exactly the moment wherein Kaylee dies, but she tells it as if it's just a story she's reading.
And I think it's important for everyone to remember, and I feel like people are getting smarter about this, and smarter might be the wrong word, but more educated, or they're starting to understand the tricks better. There was a story recently, I think maybe in the New York Times, I forget exactly where it was. It was about what happened to truth and true crime. And the whole point was there's so much manipulation in true crime content these days because everyone is going for the big splash, and they wanted the big splash here, and they needed just another Casey Anthony documentary. I mean, there's a ton of those, right? In order to get the big splash, you needed Casey. And I don't care what Casey says, she knew going in this was going to be a friendly documentary. She knew that they were going to let her tell her story basically uninterrupted without any difficult questions, and there are no hard questions for her, and that it would be framed in the best possible light. So this is the very best possible light for Casey, and they have set this up to make her seem as believable and as sympathetic as possible. I think most of you who know the story, your next question was probably, what next? So this happened, your dad said this, but then you just sort of went about your business. Why did you do that? Well, Casey, she has an answer for that. She says that, the reason she acted the way she did after Kaylee disappeared, she was trying to act normal. Her roommates who were interviewed confirmed that she was normal, she was happy. She says And this is hard to believe, but this is what she says, that she genuinely believed Kaylee was alive. Despite the story she just told you and everything that went down, she genuinely believed Kaylee was alive because she was so conditioned by her father to believe anything he told her and to do anything he said. And her dad had told her, Kaylee's going to be fine. You're going to be reunited soon. And Casey, she uses phone records to say that she called her dad a lot. And this is her way of proving this, that she was constantly checking in with her father, asking about Kaylee. It wasn't true that she never worried about Kaylee. I mean, that's the story the prosecution told, is that for 30 days or however long it was, she partied all the time. She went to the bars, to the clubs. Everything was great. And she says, no, I was actually checking in on Kaylee the whole time. But I also was trying to put forward this image of everything is fine. And in fact, she says she believed Kaylee was okay until December of 2008 when her body was found. So even after Casey had been arrested for the murder of her child, was in jail, she still believed that everything was going to be okay. She says that she regularly met with George, where he would tell her if she just kept telling her mother what he told her to say, she'd eventually get her daughter back.
Now, Casey says it was like she was brainwashed by her dad. We hear this multiple times. And yet Casey also says that she never left Kaylee with her dad because he had abused Casey, and Casey wanted to protect her daughter from the abuse that she felt was sure to come from her dad. That's just an interesting, her story is in tension with itself. And like Brett said, we are taking her exact words in the best light possible in a friendly documentary and just testing it against the evidence and the inconsistencies that she herself says. And she said that she knew what George was capable of. In fact, Casey says that she never believed Kaylee drowned in the pool, not even initially, because she knew there was no way Kaylee could have gotten into the pool. So which was it? Was Casey brainwashed, or was she an ever vigilant mother trying to protect her daughter from the man she knew was a monster? Did she believe her father? Or did she believe he'd just murdered her daughter? And even if initially she wanted to believe George, did she really believe him for 31 days, even after she stopped seeing Kaylee? That's a long time. Like, what would take 31 days for her to be okay? Why would she have to be separated if, in fact, she was okay? There are just so many questions that there are no follow-up questions to. I think questions that all of us had as she was speaking. And the reason it was so frustrating for me to watch the documentary is the natural follow-up questions were never asked. And there are so many more inconsistencies with her story. Why did Casey keep up the lie even after she was arrested by the police under the belief that she had murdered her child? And even after Kaylee's body was found? If she had thought Kaylee was okay until that point, this should have been utterly just earth-shattering, because she, by her words, believed for 31 days that Kaylee was just fine. But when she is found dead, why did she not tell the police the story that Jose Baez told her at trial at the first opportunity? Why didn't she come clean at that point? What is there to hide? Because clearly George had been lying, if we are to believe Casey. Now, on the one hand, Casey says that she did everything she could to protect her daughter from her father. We've talked about that. But on the other hand, she says that she believed George had kidnapped her daughter and was holding her somewhere. If both of those things are true, why wouldn't she just call the police? Once again, are we to believe that Casey was brainwashed and fully under George's control? Or was she open-eyed and terrified that her evil father would abuse her daughter like she was abused? Those are two stories that are truly in tension with each other that she is putting forth.
And if you've watched this documentary, the first 2 episodes, it's just constantly like this. In the one moment, she'll say things like, well, I believed everything he said. I was conditioned to believe him. It was like I was brainwashed. And then literally the next scene, she's talking about how she was constantly on guard, protecting her daughter, never leaving her alone with her father, which isn't true, by the way. Just the simple fact that she was constantly leaving her daughter with her parents. And I'm sorry, it just doesn't work to say, well, maybe her mother was always there too. If what Casey's telling us is true, her father sexually abused her for decades under her mother's nose. So why would she ever leave her daughter there if this is true? You have to chalk up a lot to just the trauma that Casey would have been under if her father had been abusing her for all these years. And I don't discount that if it's true, that would have been a lot of trauma and that it would have really messed with her head and maybe it would make her do things that you wouldn't expect. But just a surface level watch of this, even if you're just listening to what she's saying, there's so much contradiction running through it. And then as you start to add in different factors, you see that maybe the contradiction isn't the result of trauma, but is actually the result of a poorly formulated story falling apart. But she is committed to it, particularly by the time we get to the third episode. Once we're in the third episode, Casey goes full in on George. She starts to add new factors, new elements that she had not mentioned before. She says that George would suffocate Casey with a pillow to knock her out so that he could then rape her while she was unconscious. She offers this to her private investigator friend when he suggests maybe there was an accident involving George and Kaylee when George was abusing Kaylee. And this is an interesting thing for Casey. It's been 20 years. I don't know, I was fascinated by this. There's a lot of interviews with people who are friends of Casey and know Casey. And one thing that is interesting is they all say something along the lines of never really asked her about it, never fully confronted her with it, believed her. The man she lived with for a very long time, who sort of took her under his wing, is this private investigator who worked on her case, and she would help him do research, and he would pay her a little bit and give her free rent. And he sees her as like a daughter, essentially. And he even says, I never really asked her. And so the camera is supposedly catching Casey sharing some of these details for the first time. And at some point he suggests, well, maybe there was an accident. Maybe George got Kaylee somehow out of your room and he was abusing her and an accident happened. And she throws up this, well, he used to suffocate me with a pillow. So, and this, of course, is supposed to plant the kernel in your mind that that's what happened here, that George suffocated Kaylee. And then in order to cover it up, he faked the drowning, not Casey.
But that's so interesting because, like you're saying, Brett, it's really her friend, the private investigator, who tosses up this alternative theory. And we've talked about this at trial. Reasonable doubt is not just that any other theory can exist. The evidence has to also be able to support that alternative theory, because we can sit here and list a million different alternative theories that have zero basis in evidence. And again, if we know for a fact that Kaylee is dead, you would think that Casey would come forth with George took her. It could have been that he was trying to abuse her and he used this tactic with Casey in the past that could have led to death, but by the grace of God, Casey had never succumbed to his abuses. But maybe Kaylee was so young that she had succumbed to his abuses. But this is not how it happens. It's not that she comes out with it and then the evidence supports it. She hears an alternative theory and then fills in the story with, that could have been what happened.
And if you believe that Casey is a master manipulator, that's exactly what you would expect. That's exactly the way manipulators work. They take things and they spin them into plausible stories that it's almost confirmation bias. They almost take advantage of that. They take sort of the tip of the iceberg and they use it to then create an entire story. Some of you know about cold reading. So it's this whole notion of, some of you who've seen psychics, for instance, and the way they work, they can take little details and then spin an entire story that has enough believability to you that you grab onto it and you believe it. And that's essentially what Casey's doing whenever she talks about this. But it's not just her. The documentary is fully on her side and is pushing the same thing. And one of the more manipulative moments in the entire documentary, Casey says that George testified in front of the grand jury, as if this is somehow significant or some sort of bombshell or would be unexpected. It's just sort of thrown out there like, can you believe it? George testified in front of the grand jury. But of course he did. He would have been subpoenaed. He would have had no choice. It's not as if he just showed up at the grand jury and said, hey, I really want to testify.
And there's no privilege that he could assert, because there's no parental privilege where he can say, I don't want to testify against my daughter. We've talked about this a lot. That's why, we think very hard about whether to subpoena parents of our targets, because they have to come, but we don't always know if parents will be truthful. So here, George, if he were subpoenaed, which he would have been, would not have any choice but to come. It wasn't of his own volition.
And if you want to know more about privilege, check out our other podcast, Legal Briefs, where we had did an entire episode on privilege. And George is an obvious witness for a lot of reasons. Not least significantly, he is one of, if not the last person, to see Kaylee alive other than Casey. Of course, he testified before the grand jury. And one of the defense attorneys gets on this documentary and says, "We don't know what he said to the grand jury, and we'll never know." But that isn't true. George testified at trial. The defense would have been entitled to his grand jury testimony for impeachment purposes. That's one reason you want people to testify before the grand jury. You're locking them into their testimony so they can't change it later on. And why sometimes, frankly, you don't want them to testify, because they're going to testify once and they can be impeached with that later on. And in fact, Florida Statute 905.27 says, testimony not to be disclosed, exceptions. A grand juror, state attorney, assistant state attorney, reporter, stenographer, interpreter, or any other person appearing before the grand jury shall not disclose the testimony of a witness examined before the grand jury or other evidence received by it, except when required by a court to disclose the testimony for the purpose of ascertaining whether it is consistent with the testimony given by the witness before the court. The defense absolutely would have had his testimony. They would have used it to impeach him if he changed his story. And for the documentary and the defense attorneys to sell to you that they will never know and it's some great mystery, I mean, they are more than happy to lie to you. And that's another reason you've got to take everything that these people tell you with a huge grain of salt. They are selling you a story as if they were Casey's defense attorneys.
Angie is your home for everything home. And they've made it easier than ever to connect with skilled professionals to get all your home projects done well. If you own a home, you know how much work it can take. Whether it's everyday maintenance and repairs or making dream projects a reality, it can be hard just to know where to start. But now, all you need to do is Angie that and find a skilled local pro who will deliver the quality and expertise you need. Those of you who've been following us for a long time have heard about our house woes, from a tree going through Brett's roof to me sitting in a dark closet because my lights went out and I didn't know how to fix the actual socket. Well, thanks to Angie, I was able to find this electrician who showed up at my door on time, figured out a relatively easy fix. And no, guys, it wasn't just changing out the light bulb. He had to do some electrician work. And I'm so glad I had Angie for it, because they had the home experts for me and they were able to just deliver it right to my door. It took all of the guesswork out of home projects.
And Alice, you can turn to Angie with confidence, no matter what the size of your home or the size of your project. Whether you've got a 100-year-old house like I do, where it seems like things are always breaking, or if you're renting and you're needing someone to help you with moving, installations, or cleaning, Angie is there for you, and they're there for you with confidence. So, Angie has over 20 years of home service experience, and they've combined it with new tools to simplify the whole process. Bring them your project online or with Angie's app, answer a few questions, and Angie can handle the rest from start to finish. Or they can help you compare quotes from multiple pros and connect instantly, which means you can take care of just about any home project in just a few taps. Because when it comes to getting the most out of your home, you can do this when you Angie that. Download the free Angie mobile app today or visit Angie.com. That's ANGI.com. Check them out today. Angie.com. ANGI.com.
Brett, before we move on, you know that now that I have 3 kids, I have so much laundry to do. And because of that, I've really been thinking about why I lug these huge tubs of laundry detergent around in order to do all my laundry. I mean, who wants that? 91% of those inconvenient, awkward, heavy jugs end up in landfills and oceans, harming our planet and marine life. There has to be a better way. And it's not like you can just stop doing laundry. So do what I did. Switch to Earth Breeze. My new Earth Breeze laundry detergent eco sheets look like dryer sheets, but they're not. It's a revolutionary liquidless laundry detergent that dissolves 100% in any wash cycle, hot or cold. No measuring, no mess, and no heavy plastic jugs. Just toss the sheet in. And Earth Breeze has really made the whole concept of detergent better. The packaging is lightweight, biodegradable, and plastic-free. It's great for all laundry lifestyles, even sensitive skin. My babies all do great with their eco sheets because they're hypoallergenic and dermatologist tested.
Alice, I can't believe no one's come up with this before. It makes laundry so much easier. I love just having a box of eco sheets, not having to worry about those big plastic jugs. It's so much better. It is worlds better. It's not messy, and it's not clogging up your laundry room. And the great thing about EarthBreeze is they make it easy. They offer flexible subscriptions that can be adjusted, paused, or canceled by you at any time, no contracts or fees, and it is delivered right to your door via free carbon-neutral shipping at a frequency you can set that works for you. And the most important thing of all, and the thing that matters to you the most, you still get a powerful clean. EarthBreeze is tough on stains, fights odors, and your clothes come out clean every time. Don't just take our word for it. They are offering you a risk-free 100% satisfaction guarantee. If you don't like it, EarthBreeze will give you a full refund, no questions asked, and no returns necessary. So switch from the old-fashioned goo to something new. Right now, our listeners can subscribe to EarthBreeze and save 40%. Go to earthbreeze.com/prosecutors to get started. That's earthbreeze.com/prosecutors for 40% off. earthbreeze.com/prosecutors.
Yeah, certainly. This documentary is not under oath. Remember that. This documentary is honestly meant to be entertainment. Of course, the audience doesn't necessarily know that, but these documentarians, no one took an oath beforehand. This is not transcribed as if you're in court. They are trying to make a documentary that people will watch and they'll make money off of. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but when something's being sold to you, you have to think, does this really match the hard, cold evidence? And the real story would be if they were not privy to the grand jury testimony of George, which they've never alleged here. So we know that's not true. And we know that not to be the truth as well, because they would have filed some motion at some point of, not turning over evidence that they were entitled to at trial.
And at one point in the documentary, it even says that after saying, we have no idea what George said, it's a complete mystery, right? That he was the star witness in the grand jury. How exactly did they know that? Which is the lie? That they have no idea what he said, or that they know what he said and he was the star witness? The amount of manipulation going on here, it's so underhanded and so disingenuous. And they direct it at this poor random guy who was one of Casey's roommates, who they throw this information at to try and get him to change his story because he's convinced it's Casey. And they're like, did you know that George testified? Would that change your view? And they're asking him hard questions like he's the defendant. They never ask Casey a single hard question about what happened that night. And that should tell you everything that you need to know about this. George also told Casey's lawyers that they couldn't believe anything she said. This was a very important thing for her lawyers to know. They couldn't trust anything that she said to them, and Jose Baez was smart enough to take that to heart. George, if he did anything, he helped Casey, because he made it very clear to her lawyers, you cannot trust her, you cannot trust what she said, and that sort of opened the door for Jose Baez to do a couple things. Number one, not to delve too deep into her actual words, because you don't want to figure out just how much she is lying, but also he could construct whatever story he wanted to, and he knew it would generally fit with what Casey was saying. So, it's funny. On the one hand, George is her best friend. On the other hand, he's the one selling her out.
And let's not lose sight of the fact. I mean, I know we've heard this version of the story through the years, so it may not be as shocking, but we have here Casey fingering her father as not only her sexual abuser, but the murderer of her child. I mean, this is really sad on a family level, right? We've talked a lot about the Anthony family, and every family has their issues, but we are watching a child accuse their father of murdering his granddaughter. And we talked about how Casey's words are so slippery. She can manipulate them, change them, even as she is confronted with a lie throughout the investigation, throughout trial, and throughout this documentary. She just pivots without turning red, without batting an eye. She pivots and kind of slightly changes her words repeatedly so that you can't quite grab her. But there are some obvious lies. And since, we've already done the entire Casey Anthony episodes, you can go listen to all of those in detail. And that's not what this episode is about. Let's just bullet point for you some of her obvious lies so that if for any reason you think, well, I don't know, we just never got to hear from Casey, this is compelling. Let me just point out some very, very black and white lies for you that she says in her own words. Casey says that she didn't take a guilty plea because she was not guilty. She says that she admitted guilt, that she lied to the cops. In fact, she did not do that. So she's saying, I didn't murder my child, but I lied. And so I owned up to it. But the facts from the docket that you can go look at right now is that Casey contested those charges. And when convicted of lying to the police, she actually appealed those convictions. Casey says that the night before Kaylee disappeared was normal, but we know it wasn't. The night before, Casey and Cindy, her mom, got into a huge argument. Jesse Grund, and this was Casey's erstwhile fiance, will later say that on this day, Casey and her mom, Cindy, got into such a big fight that Cindy ended up grabbing Casey by the neck and strangling her before Lee Anthony, her brother, could break them up. Cindy had spoken to her mother that day and told her that she was going to seek to have custody of Kaylee. And Cindy's mother would later say that Cindy was on a mission when she left that conversation with her. Although Lee and Cindy and George would later deny the seriousness of this fight, he confided in a friend that this was the worst fight they'd ever had. And we know that Cindy and Casey fought often, but even in the Anthony household, this was a fight that stood out from others. Cindy told Casey that she knew she was lying about working when she'd left Kaylee with her, and that in fact, Casey had been partying. Cindy was kicking Casey out of the house, but Kaylee would not be going with her. I mean, this is a big, big fight, and it's told from multiple witnesses from their points of view, and their stories do meld together to paint a picture of anything but a normal night the night before.
It reminds me of the Alec Murdaugh thing, where he says, he tries to say on the stand that the day that his family was murdered was an ordinary day. He was just at my office working on some motions. And in reality, it was the day that someone from his office confronted him with the fact that they knew he was stealing money, and the day that his father, who'd been backing him up, had gone to the hospital and was going to die. Like that kind of lie where it's crazy to me that anyone would lie about it, because it's so easy to disprove it. And you can easily disprove this lie of Casey's, but it's part of her building this story that she wants you to believe.
And this is doubly weird because in the documentary, Casey says that it was her plan to leave the house. So not Cindy throwing her out, but it was her own plan. And she had wanted to leave the house, in fact, but she was afraid that if she told her mom she wanted to leave, that Cindy would try and get her to stay. This is so obviously false that it's actually astounding. Casey will now tell this lie. Casey had no real means of income because, remember, she didn't work at Universal Studios. She admitted to this after, taking the police on this grand tour of her supposed workplace when in fact she didn't work there. Cindy had confronted her with the fact that she knew Casey wasn't working, and Casey was really freeloading off her parents. She was living with them. Her parents were her childcare. She had no way of earning money to get another place to live or to pay for food, car, gas. We know these things to be true, that she couldn't afford gas very often. And honestly, with the resources she had, or really the lack of resources Casey had, she couldn't have moved out even if she wanted to do so. And so this is, again, where don't just listen to the words that she's saying. She can easily say, oh, I was the one who wanted to leave the house. But look at the facts. There was absolutely nothing to support the fact that she could leave or she took any steps really to leave. But what we do see here is her taking the element of truth, which is Cindy was kicking her out of the house, and spinning it to fit her narrative.
Then there's the day of the disappearance. So we now have Casey's definitive story of what happened that day. She woke up, she made breakfast, she laid down with Kaylee, she went to sleep, she slept for a while. When she woke up, Kaylee was missing, and very quickly thereafter, she found Kaylee dead in her father's arms, and Kaylee had drowned in the pool. That's the story. And it's told in a very emotional way, as we said, with lots of crying and tugging at your heartstrings, trying to convince you through her words and her actions and her crying that she's telling the truth. But is it consistent with the forensic evidence, the facts in this case? Here's the timeline of things we know happened. So this is June 16th, 2008. the last time Kaylee is seen alive. Casey's story's pretty short. Got breakfast, went to sleep, Kaylee disappeared, then she was dead. On that day at 7:52 a.m., Casey is searching for sexy costumes for the waitresses to wear at an upcoming event her boyfriend is hosting, the Shot Girls, as you may remember. Between 7:56 and 8:06, Casey is having an AIM conversation, AOL Instant Messenger, with a friend. She says she's checking in on MySpace and Facebook hoopla. That's what she says in the conversation. Casey remained on the computer until around 9 a.m. Between about 9 and 10, Casey is neither on the phone nor on the computer, so maybe this is when she's asleep. The problem is that she logs back onto MySpace and Facebook at approximately 10 a.m. At 10:27 a.m., Casey uploads a photo of the interior of the Fusion nightclub to her photo bucket.
At 11:43 a.m., Casey receives a Facebook message from her boyfriend, and he calls her a few minutes later at 11:47, and they have a 20-minute conversation. From 12:07 to 12:53, there's no computer or cell phone activity. At 12:50, George says that he sees Casey and Kaylee leave, and this is the last time George sees Kaylee alive. During his testimony, George is adamant about the time, saying he would never forget it because he was watching an episode of Diners, Drive-Ups, and Dives. It was a commercial break, and he remembered exactly what Kaylee was wearing when she went out of her room. In fact, Kaylee told him that she was going to see Zanny. He watched them leave in their car. At 12:53, Casey texts her boyfriend that she's leaving the house. And that's consistent with George saying that they left at 12:50. At 1 p.m., Casey calls her boyfriend and has a 15-minute conversation. At 1:26 p.m., Casey exchanges text messages with Jesse Grund. And at 1:39 p.m., there is activity on the computer indicating that Casey is logging back into her AOL Instant Messenger, Facebook, and MySpace pages. At 1:42, Casey calls her friend Amy Huizinga. They are on the phone for about 40 minutes until 2:21 p.m. Somewhere around 2:30 to 2:40, George leaves for work, and he is at work by 3 p.m., and this has been confirmed at trial. 2:51 p.m., someone searches on Firefox for, quote, foolproof suffocation. And this search is made on Casey's password-protected account. It's also made on Firefox, which is the browser that Casey used to access all those other pages we talked about. Her parents did not use Firefox. Rather, they used Internet Explorer. At 2:52 p.m., someone logs back onto MySpace.
So at 2:53, Casey answers a call from Jesse Grund. They talk for 12 minutes, and she is pinging from the home the entire time that we've been talking about. At 3:04, Casey hangs up with Grund, and George Anthony calls her. The call between the two lasted 26 seconds. Whether it was answered or not is unclear. At 3:35, Casey calls her boyfriend, Tony Lazzaro, but he didn't answer. Then came 4:10. At this point, a flurry of calls begins. Casey calls her father's work at 4:10:41, but gets no answer. At 4:11:25, she calls her mom's cell, but still no answer. She calls the cell again at 4:11:49, 4:13:04, and 4:13:29. At 4:14:48, she calls Lexus, where her dad works, again. At 4:19:47, she calls Tony Lazzaro again. At 4:21:32 and 4:21:56, she calls Jesse Grund. At 4:25, she calls Cindy one more time, and then there are no more calls until 6:31, when she once again calls Cindy unsuccessfully. She calls her again at 6:32, then she calls the home phone, a call that lasted 1 minute. Around 7, she called the home phone again, and that call lasted 2 minutes. Casey talked to her mom and told her she and Kaylee were going to stay with Zanny that night. So given that timeline, when exactly did the events Casey describes happen? Nothing about it fits with her story. Nothing about it fits with the story of waking up, making breakfast, going to sleep, and then waking up to find her daughter missing. In fact, throughout the day, Casey is doing things, and she's doing things that don't indicate anything is necessarily wrong, including things like being on AIM and Facebook and uploading photos and looking for sexy shot girl pictures and calling her best friend and calling her ex-fiance and calling her boyfriend. All these things are happening on the day where she tells a very tight timeline of events that would have put Kaylee's death much earlier in the morning. And basically, at some point, George leaves, takes care of the body, and then I guess goes on to work so that he can be there by 3 o'clock. None of that story fits with these facts. These are uncontrovertible facts. All of them happened. There are records of them. There are cell phone records of them and computer records of these things happening. None of them are mentioned by Casey. In the story that she tells you in the documentary, none of this stuff comes up.
And, we've talked about how we're looking at cold, hard facts. And, of course, we're trying to interpret what they mean. But really, we see a lackadaisical day, probably a very typical day of checking your social media pages, talking to friends. There isn't actually any flurry until the 4 o'clock time period when we know that George is at work. So if anything were to happen, and we talked about this in our Casey Anthony episodes, something likely happened in that kind of 3:30 to 4:30 time period, whether it was that something was happening to Kaylee, or that Casey was trying to find help, or she was about to do something. But that period of time is inconsistent with her activity the rest of the day. And that's very interesting because whatever happened then likely had something to do with Kaylee. And that happens to be the exact time that George is not there. He is at work. And the problem with this is Casey's central story of anything happening to Kaylee centers around George, but George is not there when her actions seem to show that something is afoot. And what about that foolproof suffocation? Casey denies she made that search, and she claims that George made that search. George had to be at work at 3 p.m. Work, according to Casey, was 20 minutes away, and that search was made at 2:51 p.m. In other words, George had to have been more than halfway to work at that point if he was at work by 3. And again, it was made on Firefox, which we know that Casey used regularly. She used it that day, in fact, for all of her communications and her MySpace pages and AOL Instant Messenger. And we know that George and Cindy did not use that browser. We know that they used Internet Explorer. And that foolproof suffocation search was immediately followed by a logon into Casey's MySpace, which we know that Casey used and George did not. Now, put aside Casey's behavior. Assume for a second that her callousness, her lack of any concern for her daughter, the fact that she never looks for Kaylee, never reports Kaylee missing to the police, is all a product of her abuse at the hands of her father. Let's take a look at the physical evidence in this case. Casey's story just does not account for the conditions of her trunk. The smell of decomposition was so strong that when police parked the car in a 2-bay garage, the smell filled the entire garage. Casey's friends reported smelling it in her car before, and Casey claimed that she must have hit an animal. In other words, it was not something that could be escaped, right? People had started to point this out to Casey even before Kaylee was found, and Casey acknowledged it. It's not like she said, "I don't smell it. What are you talking about? What smell?" She acknowledges the smell and makes an excuse for it, saying she must have hit an animal. You wouldn't say that if you didn't smell it yourself. You would say, "What are you talking about? Get your nose checked. There's nothing that smells here." But of course she can't deny it, because what do we see when Casey is confronted with cold hard evidence? She spins a story, and that's what she did here. And we know that a police cadaver dog alerted on the trunk. And when the police opened it, they noticed a couple things. One, it had clearly been vacuumed out. Second, there is a stain in the trunk about the size of a small body, and the police removed some of the lining of the trunk to test that stain. They also noticed some hairs that they believe are Kaylee's. These hairs have what is called post-mortem banding, which indicates that they are from Kaylee after she died. That's really interesting because we may not be surprised to find Kaylee's hair in her mother's car. Might be a little weird to find it in the trunk, but I throw lots of kid gear into my trunk, the stroller, the diaper bag, whatever. So maybe it's not that strange that Kaylee's hair would be in the trunk, but it is strange because it's not from a live body. The hair is from a dead body. I mean, that is just it's hard for me to even say that because I'm envisioning Kaylee's body in her mother's trunk at her mother's hands. And it's a very difficult thing to envision for a third party, me. And yet we have Casey kind of telling these lies that we know to be lies directly to the camera without batting an eye.
It's sort of remarkable. Casey's had 15 years to come up with this story. And yet the story she comes up with is so inadequate to address the issues. And I think one of the problems for her is there's so many. But this is something she doesn't even deal with. I mean, she doesn't even say, and then my dad said, give me the keys to your car. I'm going to take Kaylee somewhere where she'll be safe. Doesn't even say that. Doesn't even throw that in there. And then he came back later and there was no Kaylee. Doesn't even do that. It's just he went off, sort of disappeared, never came back. Then she went on with her day that day and talked to him on the phone later on. And that's it. You know, this call where this 20-something second call when he was at work is always said to be the call between them where he says it's taken care of. But once again, that doesn't explain the car. It doesn't explain why the car is in the situation it's in. And it also doesn't explain something we talked about as well. And look, I recommend selfishly that you all go listen to this 6-part, 7-part, however long it was, series we did on Casey Anthony, where we walk through this in much more exhaustive detail because there's so much about her father and what he would have had to have done and what you'd have to believe that he was doing, why he would dump her body so close to the family home when it could so easily be found, why he would be the first person to alert anyone to the smell of decomposition in the car if the whole point is to cover this up. It just, none of it makes any sense. And the story that Casey cobbles together just doesn't work. I will give her credit for one thing, because she says something that I have said before that I believe. She says that in every one of her stories, there is some kernel of truth. And I think this is her kind of giving it away. I think there is a kernel of truth in what she's saying. I'm not sure exactly what it is. Is it possible that her father abused her? Maybe. Who knows? Could very well have happened. Maybe it's even probable. Though I will tell you, I don't find the evidence of it in the documentary very convincing. It's so funny to me, the things they highlight. And they're like, oh my goodness. Casey acts like she's watching stuff for the first time and hearing her father make comments and being shocked that he would say something like that. You know, he says something about Kaylee's smell. And people freaked out about that when he said something about he misses her smell. Maybe that's weird. I don't know. I have a daughter. I know exactly what he's talking about. Like when your child's been happy and playing and running around in the grass and they come up and give you a hug, that is something you would remember. So I don't know if that's weird or not, but the documentary tries to make it seem like it's the weirdest thing in the world. And these are the kinds of pieces of proof that are offered to you to back this up. And I just want you to remember, you don't have George there. George isn't defending himself. You've got a documentary that's taking bits and pieces, chopping it up, and selling it back to you, often through Casey Anthony's voice. This is a piece of propaganda, is what it is. So I don't know. Maybe he was abusing her. Casey very intentionally channels the language of victims of abuse. She does it whenever it's helpful for her. She does everything in her power to generate sympathy. She wants you to sympathize with her.
And can we say that we've recently seen this again? I know we've been drawing a lot of parallels to the Murdaugh trial, but remember, we've talked a lot about how Alec Murdaugh, while he was on the stand, whether he really had an addiction problem or not, he certainly adopted the language of those who really suffer from opioid addiction to try and seek sympathy from the jurors. It didn't ultimately work, of course, and there's questions as to whether and how severe any addiction he would have had. But this is not like a new tactic. People do this all the time. There are certain almost like untouchables in society, right? Like those who have been abused, especially sexual abuse. You know, there is a mentality of believe the victim, and there should be, I think. But Casey is adopting that and using it for her advantage, recognizing that it's hard to challenge someone on such a grotesque allegation. And in a way, it's a shield to be able to hide behind the type of allegation that oftentimes we don't want to ask hard questions about because we think that it will be very difficult for the victim to have to remember. But here's the thing. Brett and I when we have witnesses on the stand who do allege these sorts of crimes, like sexual abuse, we do have to ask those hard questions. So we have actually been in the position where we've had to ask the follow-up questions, the questions that are not okay to ask in like little politically correct conversations. We have to ask those questions because the law requires us to ask those follow-up questions, and they are difficult. And we have to do it with a lot of care and a lot of compassion, but we have to ask those questions. So we know what those follow-up questions are. We know how victims have responded time and again when we do ask those questions. And Casey really, it's like she's trying on an outfit that is not hers. You know, she says those words, but the way she acts and the way she responds is really just inconsistent with what we've seen with victims of abuse.
Yeah, and it's so true, and it's just the perfect tool of a manipulator. In so many ways, this is so consistent with someone who is constantly manipulating others to do this, and she knows the effect it's going to have. If she's a victim, then maybe all of her strange behavior does make sense. The things we were talking about at the beginning of this episode. I'm sure some of you were thinking, well, yeah, but if she was abused her whole life, then all those contradictions make sense. She knows that you're going to think that. She wants you to think that. And more importantly, she knows it will shut down questioning. If she's a victim, then you feel guilty. It's like Alice was just saying, you feel bad questioning her. But the thing is, we can talk about Casey's behavior all day long, but it's not just about her behavior. We have her story now. We have the story. Put aside how weird she acts. Put aside, whether she's crying or not, or whether she has tails when she's lying or not. Just put it all aside. We have her story. Take her story. Take her word for it. It does not fit the timeline. It does not fit the evidence. It doesn't fit it at all. After watching this, you should be more convinced of her guilt, not less. If she had gotten on the stand and told this story, she would have been convicted. Her lies are right there for you to see, repeated ad nauseum, even in this setting. Not on the stand, not under cross-examination. In this setting with a friendly documentarian, she still can't make up enough lies to overcome the facts around Kaylee's death. Did George abuse Casey? We'll never know for sure. Neither one of them can be counted on to tell the truth about much of anything. But what we can know for sure now, I think, even more so than at the end of the trial or at the end of our last discussion of this, is that Casey Anthony killed her daughter. I think she killed her daughter pretty shortly after her father left for work that day. As I said in our longer set of episodes, I think she was getting kicked out of that house. Everything was coming to a head. It was kind of like the Murdaugh trial. It's kind of funny, the parallels. She asked her father to get her out of it. He said no. And then after that, the die was cast. And she killed her daughter. She drowned her in that pool. And then that flurry of calls was supposed to be the something terrible has happened. Come help me. But for the first time ever, nobody answered. And so she was left in this situation where she had to basically very quickly do this disposal of the body and then move on. That's what I think happened. And I think when you hear this story, you should be even more convinced that Casey's lying to you and that in reality, she is responsible for killing her daughter, and unfortunately, she got away with it.
And because of what you just said, Brett, I'm glad this documentary exists. I started this episode by saying how disgusted I was with it and how I didn't want to keep watching it. I actually am very glad that this documentary exists. I'm glad that this was a friendly documentary, that it was the first documentary where it was Casey in her own words, and that she admits this is in her own words, that she's not asked hard questions. I'm glad that this is the best case scenario possible. She had 15 years to think of a complete foolproof alibi or a story of what happened. She has had time to think this over. She has documentarians whose job is to make her be convincing. They don't ask her hard questions. Even when people are interviewed and say things that may make her look slightly bad, the documentarians jump to her defense. Casey doesn't have to be the one to defend herself. She doesn't have to defend herself at all in this documentary. And we hear unfiltered the best case scenario story for Casey, and it falls so far short of the truth. And that's why I'm glad this documentary exists. Because if you had any doubt before of her guilt and the fact that she got away with murder of her daughter, you shouldn't anymore after this documentary. She's had a chance to say everything she wanted on her mind, and she did. And we have that to be able to compare to the evidence. And again, it's a devastating realization. I don't want to live in a world where mothers can kill their children. I'm quite literally recording this episode with my baby strapped to my chest. This is very personal, but I think from this documentary, it's hard to reach any other conclusion than what Brett just said. We will not know exactly the step-by-step, minute-by-minute of what happened to Kaylee, because the person who knows that, and the only person who knows that, is Casey. But she is the only one who knows it because she was there when Kaylee died, and she was the cause of that death. And so we hope that, go watch this documentary for yourself, but don't stop there. Think about how it matches on to all the evidence that exists, all the trial evidence that came in when people spoke under oath, when documents were admitted that are quote unquote foolproof. They are what they are. They are timestamps. They tell us where certain things happen at certain times. And her story, the best story she could come up with, does not fit it.
And let me just say, this is the last time we're going to talk about Casey Anthony.
I hope so.
No more Casey Anthony.
I hope so.
Don't ask us for any more Casey Anthony. I'm tired of this woman. And she is the worst. But she's also proof that, number one, you can get away with murder, and number two, no matter how obvious it is you did it, there's always somebody who will believe you. So, and she has defenders, and she has people who believe that she's completely innocent. You'll never convince me of that. Well, obviously, we're interested in your thoughts on this. Those of you who watch the documentary, what do you think? Are you still convinced? Did we sway you at all, or were you, always convinced that Casey really did do it? Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod. For all your social media, check us out on Patreon if you want to hear your episodes early and ad-free. And hello to those of you listening on YouTube. Remember, if you do a 5-star review and you leave a question, we will answer your question on a show. Given that Alice has a baby strapped to her right now, we'll probably go ahead and move on from that section this time. But next time, we're definitely doing questions. So send us your questions in the form of a 5-star review. You do the 5-star review, we'll answer your question on the show. Well, Alice, before we sign off today, let me just say thank you so much for doing this. You're amazing. I hope everyone recognizes how amazing you are. But is there anything else you want to add?
No, I love our fans because I do have to say, those of you who are who've gone through newborn stage or going through it yourself, I feel you. And the amount of understanding that our fans on the gallery have for what this stage of life is, which is to say it's all encompassing, is just incredible. So I just want to say, as we've said many times before, we have the best listeners, and thanks for being flexible with me too, Brett. You're the best. We've tried to record 4 days this week, and every single one of them failed until today. So thank you for being flexible
Anytime.
with me.
Anytime, Alice. You're the absolute best, and, whatever it takes. Okay, guys, we'll be back next week with a new case. I promise you, it won't be Casey Anthony. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors.
Right, so let's just dive in, because what we all care about is what happened. Oh, working mothers have it hard. Really quick, Brett, on that point, of course, the documentary has an aim. It's see if this works.
Oh, it's so cute. It's so cute.
It's really sweet to say that. Okay. The documentary has an aim. It's, oh my gosh. My child loves my voice. She did it.
Yay.
Way to go, girlfriend.
Good job.
Thank you. Sorry for all of
No,
it.
not a problem at all.
Now that I know she will sleep on me, this is a game changer. So this is good.
See what's streaming free all month long during Amplify AAPI Voices on Pluto TV. Watch shows like Kim's Convenience with Simu Liu and amazing movies like Meet the Patels and Jason Momoa in Braven. Plus, Pluto TV has hundreds of channels with thousands more movies and TV shows available on live and on demand. Download Pluto TV on all your favorite devices for free.